Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be reviewing another fight that I had at the Clash for the Cash tournament a few weekends ago, where you might recognize I fought Stephen Shaney and made my last video. However, this fight is against Sam Riles, another really skilled opponent who has actually beaten me more often than not in past tournaments. But either way, we have a really close fight that's very informative. Coming into this first exchange, my opponent comes in directly for the kill, trying to stab me on my offside, which I attempt to parry and unsuccessfully try to Zverk my way out of. As you can see through the footage though, that thrust does stick very nicely into my right shoulder. However, it does not actively prevent me from failing my parry and then attempting my left Zverk on the offside. You'll notice this happens because I use a little bit of offline footwork to move off to my left, which helps open up a line that normally would have been closed by my opponent's thrust. For the second exchange, my opponent tries to do the exact same thing that worked out very well for him in the previous one. He goes for a stab onto my right shoulder. However, this time things were a little different, as there was a bit of a feeling out period beforehand where both of us were trying to fish for some free hand shots. As a result, the distance at which we engaged was a little bit further apart than the first time, which means that when my opponent went for his thrust, he was just a little bit further away than last time, which means that his thrust was unable to land successfully, and because it wasn't successful in landing, my exact same response of parrying off to my side and then throwing his Zverkow onto my left side, my opponent's right side, worked out much better. For this next exchange, it is now my turn to throw a thrust to my opponent's offside and also be a little bit too far away in order to land it. However, there's a little bit of a difference in what happens after I miss. As you can see by watching this, after I miss my thrust, I pull my sword up and point my tip towards the ceiling while keeping my crossguard horizontal. The reason I do this is because my horizontal crossguard allows me to defend myself very effectively from any descending cuts that my opponent might throw. As you see, my opponent does throw one of these descending cuts as an attempt to capitalize on the fact that I missed, but I'm pretty easily able to windshield wiper my blade to either my left or my right side to keep myself safe. After we separate, I feint another deep attack, which my opponent attempts to parry, only to find out that there was nothing there to parry, at which point I morph my attack into a hand shot, which is successful in hitting just the very tip of my opponent's knuckles. At this point, my opponent and I have established quite a bit of a pattern. We're both attempting to go for offside thrusts, while the other person attempts to parry and throw a Zverkow repost. However, we are both now starting to realize that if we fake our attacks, we can open up each other to hand shots. So my opponent once again throws another deep stab on my offside, which lands very quickly. However, in doing so, he catches me in a situation where I was looking for a hand shot and not necessarily expecting to be stabbed. Meaning that when this thrust lands on my right shoulder, as many have already in the past, I am unable to deflect it out of the way, and most importantly, because of the hand shot I was going for, that's all I really get, and I'm unable to throw my usual follow-up Zverkows. Essentially, I put myself in a situation where I had an expectation of what my opponent was going to do, and by simply reverting back to what worked, my opponent tricked me into basically changing up my defense from something that did work to something that couldn't work. This next exchange is a very short one, but it's not without its tactical merit. You see, both myself and my opponent are attempting to trick each other into a little bit of a feedback loop, where every time it looks like we're going to go for a right side deep thrust, we instead pull it back and throw a hand shot. Every time we look like we're going to go for a hand shot, we pull it short and go for that deep right side thrust. And that's exactly what my opponent does here. He feints as though he is going to go for that deep right side thrust again, as he has previously before, only this time he pulls it short and cuts me in the hands. Because I was expecting such a deep commitment, I maintain my very defensive stance, and I have absolutely no response for when I get hit in the hands, despite the fact that, like the previous exchange, I could have gotten the better of it if I simply committed myself forward to a thrust. This is exactly the kind of mind games that goes into high-level fencing. Sometimes you don't actually have to beat your opponent by being faster than them. What you have to do is you have to maintain their expectations and play off of them so that you can get an advantageous position, hit, and get out for free. My opponent tries to break up the pattern of our previous exchanges by coming into this one with his sword well above his head in a very high guard. Now, normally when you go into a guard like this, what you're essentially trying to do is intimidate your opponent by telling them that no matter what they throw, it is always going to be lower than their sword, which means that a downward cut to your head is going to be coming. And this is usually really great for getting people to get out of a kind of plow stance, which I have been having the entire fight. However, what it also does is it limits your options for offense. Seeing my opponent in this guard, I knew that the only thing he could throw meaningfully from there was a downward strike. So I take a step forward into his range, and I immediately go into a hanging parry, meaning that I basically throw my hands also above my head and simply guess which side he's going to be throwing on. I happened to guess right. He was going to attack on my offside, my right side, and after his blade lands in my hanging parry, I have complete control of the situation. Because I took a step forward, he is completely jammed, he can't really throw any follow-ups, and as he begins to walk past me, I come out of that situation and throw a follow-up cut to what is ostensibly his back. This is a really good response if you ever see or fight somebody in a very high guard, and it only really relies that you are able to bravely step forward into range and have some confidence in your hanging parry. So far in this fight, both myself and my opponent have been attempting to lock each other into a predictable pattern. Namely, we're both attempting to use our deep thrust on the offside to set up a hand cut, and using our hand cuts to set up our deep thrusts. Every single time one of us enters the range with our point forward, the other one attempts to pull their hands back into a kind of crawl position so that they can better deflect a thrust. However, doing so exposes the hands, and as you can see in this exchange, that's exactly what happens to me. My opponent stepping into range with his point forward is more than enough to make me swing very wide at a parry for a thrust that didn't actually come, only to find that the second I have windshield wipered all the way off to one side, my opponent is already picking apart the hand that I have left exposed. This is a good demonstration of how one thrust or one attack can set up another in an infinite kind of feedback loop where you keep your opponent guessing as to which they're going to do, and then do the response based on the defensive action that they perform. Coming into this next exchange, we see the exact same pattern play out again, only this time I get the better of it. I come forward with a stab straight to my opponent's right shoulder, and catch my opponent trying to do a little bit too much of a feint as he entered measure, meaning that, as you can see in the footage, I am just barely able to get that point to stick into my opponent's shoulder while they attempt to parry off to the side. The reason they had to do such a desperate parry off to the side is because as they came forward, they recognized that they were going to feint a hand shot and didn't actually have anything to compete with the thrust that was coming at them. They bailed out of it, tried to parry, was unsuccessful in getting the parry, but because of how deep and wide that parry had to be, they also were unable to protect themselves from the follow-up that came after. For the next exchange, my opponent tries to vary up the pattern a little bit. Rather than throwing a stab to my right shoulder, he attempts to throw a stab to my right arm. And the reason he is doing this is because of the windshield wiper parry that I have been using to keep myself safe up until now. The problem with the windshield wiper parry is that it's done predominantly with the latter half of the sword, meaning that the top half of the sword is the one doing all the motion, and the bottom half of the sword isn't really moving much. A lot of people, when they execute this technique, don't move the bottom section immediately above their hands and their crossguard to actually clear the line from stabbing them in the shoulder or the bicep. Meaning that if my opponent can sneak one in, I can do the exact same parry as I have done before, only not find that it actually protects me anymore if the point manages to land in my forearm. Lucky for me, I do close off my line just far enough that this tip only gingerly touches my forearm rather than stabbing it, and I'm able to throw a follow-up cut. My opponent does a very good job of putting up their parry to try to defend from the obvious angle that I'm coming down on, and it looks like our blades get tangled for a little bit before I'm able to just come down and strike him on the shoulder. For this next exchange, as you can probably tell, we've been at this for quite a while, and we're both getting a little tired of the pattern. So we both attempt to break it at the exact same time in the exact same way. We both come forward, feint a cut on the onside, and then go to the offside to deliver the follow-up. However, upon realizing that both of us have done the exact same thing, we attempt to close off each other's dominant lines and cross the cut into each other's heads in the center line. We're both successful, meeting directly in the center line while cutting each other in the head directly. So the entire time this fight has been happening, the score has been very, very close, and my opponent is once again demonstrating to me that he has the superior skill when it comes to baiting out a good hand shot. He hits me on the hands very square. But the other important thing to consider here is that my opponent is doing a very good job of coming back from a point deficit that's very close. If my opponent were to simply have dove in deep and gone for some deep stabs, he might have been able to land them, but his chances of doing so without getting hit back would have been slim. His best chance at this point is to continue to claw back his points with these hand shots, because so far they've been one of the best ways that he's shown to be able to get points and not get any points against him. We're now at the final exchange, and as I said previously, the score is very, very tight. So tight that if both of us score, the fight will be over. Now, this particular rule set was a little strange and a little unusual, and it had a stipulation that if both people doubled, they would both get the points for what they landed. Meaning that because I was 1 point away from the point limit and my opponent was 2 away, I was technically winning, but both of us could land something clean and immediately win. And if we both landed something, the higher point value would essentially determine the winner. Which means going into this exchange, I knew that I had to land a deep target. And as you see, when I come into this measure, I immediately go for what I think is going to be a deep stab. However, my opponent, who knows that he has to get clean points in order to win, immediately backs up and goes for a big parry. I abort and go into my cron position, which I've done previously, and we have this little back and forth where we both start jittering, trying to figure out when our opponent is going to strike so that we can parry riposte. And what ends up happening is that my opponent goes for the hand shot on my offside, which I throw up a paltry kind of not very good parry, which basically involves me punching his sword out of the air, and then go for my deep cut. But because of the range that we were both at, my opponent manages to hit me in the hands, and then I manage to hit them in the elbow in the after, meaning that we both doubled and we both get 1 point, but it means that I win the fight because I hit the point limit first. It doesn't feel like a very satisfying end to this fight, but it is worth pointing out that whenever you're fighting in the final exchange or any exchange, it's always good to keep in mind what strategy you have going into each iteration, because sometimes you might change up exactly how you're going to fence and what targets you're going to go for based on what you need to win and not necessarily what you need to be the cleanest, most beautiful fencer. Some people might take a little bit of offense to the idea that I changed up how I fenced in order to try to win the fight, but what you have to recognize is that part of what makes fencing fun is the fact that I can go into these different contexts and have these contexts arise organically based on the fight as it has already happened. I and my opponent have fenced a fight up until this point that resulted in a situation where I had the advantage and I could go for whatever I wanted and my opponent had to change. Meaning that we had actually a very interesting, very realistic sort of exchange where maybe I was a bit more of a suicidal fencer and my opponent was more defensive, changing up how the exchanges have gone up until then. If you have a problem with that, well, I guess you're always going to have a problem with that. But if you'd like to see more stuff like this, feel free to like and subscribe to the channel, where I'll be making more fight reviews just like this one. Thanks, and have a good one.